Hello, everyone. This video will be going over Chapter 15, which is how to report on speeches and meetings. Now, speeches and meetings are really important ways for journalists to gather news and write stories. As you're thinking about what story you want to do next week for your print story, I highly encourage you to find a speech or a meeting that you can cover because all of the information is available in one location from one source. You can attend a short meeting that usually lasts 30 minutes to an hour at max and get a really good story from it. So when you have a really tight timeline, like you will next week, I highly encourage you to think about speeches and meetings as a great way to write a quick but meaningful story. Now, speeches are a staple of journalism. They are happening less probably because of COVID-19, but a lot of these speeches and meetings are happening virtually. And you can, of course, attend a virtual meeting of the city council or, a public official giving a speech, and that can still count for your news article for next week. So in order to know how to report on speeches and meetings, that's what this video is going to go over. Now, a speech that you would typically cover for news is going to be someone who is knowledgeable or important talking about current events. For instance, press conferences are often speeches where you have a public official standing up in front of a bunch of reporters and giving a quick speech, maybe answering questions. You also have speeches like the inaugural address, which your textbook refers to in this chapter. The main purpose of covering a speech is providing information to the public who couldn't attend the actual speech. So the job of the reporter is to take the essence of the speaker's message. You're not going to write verbatim what they say. Instead, you're going to summarize and make it concise and clear what the speaker really meant. You also want to give your audience, whether that's readers or viewers, a sense of what the attendees experienced. So what was the crowd like? What was the situation like? So there's a lot of description that needs to go in to a speech story as well. A meeting story are usually very common assignments. Besides crime reporting, which is probably the earliest report that you'll get, other beats that young journalists typically have to cover are meetings, typically from local government or civic groups, such as covering a city council, a county commission. Those are on the books weekly for people to cover, for reporters to go to and write stories about, because these meetings are concerned about public issues and therefore are important to our readers. So the main point of a meeting story is to discuss the actions that were taken during the meetings that will directly affect members of the community. So there are really two types of meeting stories. The first is an advance, and the second is a follow-up story. An advance is when a speech or meeting is announced. For instance, back in late September, the mask ordinance was set to expire for the state. And so Governor Ivey said that she was going to provide a COVID update and talk about the mask ordinance, right? And so Fox 6 News published this story on their website and covered it in their broadcast that Governor Ivey was going to give the speech Wednesday morning. And so this is an advanced story. It happens before the meeting occurs. Typically, you will write the first advanced story right when the speech or meeting is announced, and then you may cover a second advanced story, which happens the morning of or the day before the event to remind the public that the meeting is happening. So the main purpose of an advanced story is you discuss the purpose of the meeting, who's going to be there, where it is, and how the public can attend. Leads need to emphasize what is important and unusual about the meeting. So it's not newsworthy just because a meeting has been scheduled. The newsworthy aspect comes in what the topics are, or celebrities or notable people who will attend. So make sure in every advanced story you're including the date of the meeting, the time, the location, and how admission works for the public. So in order to cover a speech or a meeting, here's what you typically have to do. These will become very routine because you will go to these same meetings over and over and over again. One that I often had to cover was Birmingham City Council, and those are some intense meetings, let me tell you. But you develop a routine for how to cover these meetings. So you will typically get an agenda from the organization that's hosting the meeting. Make sure you familiarize yourself with it. A lot of times when you're going into a meeting, there's going to be a lot of things going on that you are not familiar with, that you're not expert in. There will be some very complicated topics, especially if you're dealing with like health topics like COVID-19 and you're going to a press conference at UAB Medicine. You're not going to understand everything that the speaker is saying. So it's important that you do research before the meeting to give yourself a basic understanding or foundation of what the topic is going to be about, and then do additional research after the meeting to ensure that you're getting everything right. You also want to try to learn names of people who are in the meeting prior to that meeting so that you know who is speaking when they're speaking. As you're writing your notes during the meeting, you need to attribute that information to each individual speaker. So if you don't know that the person in this picture is Mayor Woodfin, who's the Birmingham City Mayor, you're not going to be able to say, well, Birmingham City Mayor Woodfin says. You wouldn't be able to attribute it to him. So make sure you know the names of people who are speaking. You want to arrive early to the meeting. A lot of times, especially in controversial public meetings, a room will fill up. So there might not be enough room to allow you in. That's particularly true with cutbacks in the amount of space and social distancing guidelines for meetings right now. You want to be able to follow the agenda as the meeting is going on. So take notes on your agenda and follow along with what's going on. Again, you need to take detailed notes because your notes are going to be what you use to write up your story later. There may be a requirement or a need to live tweet a meeting, meaning that you are sending out tweets from your official news account about what is going on during that meeting. There might even be an obligation to produce live video of that meeting. So take those aspects into consideration. Typically, after a meeting is over, you're going to want to find certain speakers or sources to speak to for clarification so that you understand. You might need to get an official interview with that person, and you may need to ask them follow-up questions about what actually happened. As you're in the meeting, start thinking about other viewpoints that can help round out your story. For instance, if it's announced at Governor Ivey's press conference that the mask ordinance, needs to be extended, then think about people who agree with that, people who don't agree with that, how it might affect, various aspects such as businesses or schools, things like that, and start thinking about how you're going to advance and round out the story with other sources and pieces of visual information. Now, follow stories are the ones that take place after the meeting. So they are typically longer than advanced stories, but they're harder to write because they include a lot of meaningful information about what happened. So in order to do a follow story, you need to identify a central point. What was the point of this meeting? If you look at the press release on the right, the news story on the right, you'll see the Gadsden City Council met and they approved zoning changes for a particular neighborhood. So this may not sound jazzy, but for people in the East Gadsden neighborhood, they really care about this, right? So you need to think about what the angle of your story is going to be. Later in this Fox 6 article on the right, Dixon Hayes actually spoke to members of the neighborhood, both those who were in support of the zoning changes and those who didn't like what the council did. They spoke to the actual city council members. So you want to include other viewpoints and reactions to the meeting. You also need to describe the situation and environment of what happened. So for instance, if the council members kind of fought internally while discussing the issue, you would obviously include that. If people were protesting or shouting in the middle of the meeting, you need to make note of that so that people who weren't there kind of understand how it felt to be there. In order to write a speech or meeting story, you need to select one main idea or topic. This is usually the easiest way to do that. In the Gadsden City Council story, I'm sure that the City Council talked about way more than just the zoning of this one neighborhood. However, for that particular story, Dixon Hayes felt that that was the most important topic that had been covered. He pulled that one issue out and wrote a story about it. Now, you can do a roundup story, which is if there's several key things that happen, you can summarize each of those in 2 or 3 sentences, but typically you're going to want to stick with one main idea. You need to write an interesting lead. Meetings can be very boring. In fact, that's why attention to public affairs tends to be very minor. It's why most people don't actually attend the meeting. So it's your job as the journalist to find the action, find what is interesting, and connect it back to news values. That might be the event itself. If the event was controversial, if the meeting held a lot of controversy or was really well attended, if people were very passionate about what happened or something unusual happened during the event. It could be a particular speaker. If a particular speaker, has an interesting opinion or suggestion, if they had something controversial to say, then the story and the lead could focus on the speaker themselves. You could focus on the reaction to what happened in the meeting, because that might be the most interesting part. Or you could tell a general story about what happened. There are examples of all of these provided in your textbook, and I highly suggest that you go read those. The inverted pyramid style is most often used for speech and meeting stories because speeches don't typically follow kind of a timeline. Instead, they use the order of importance to share information. So that's what we as journalists need to do. We need to pick out the details that matter to the public and report those, and leave the others out entirely or summarize them very quickly. The most important thing about speech and meeting stories is being able to attribute facts back to speakers. So a lot of times, we'll say something like, the mask ordinance is needed for Alabama. Well, that's an opinion. You may agree with that or you may not, but it's still an opinion. So it would be important after covering Governor Ivey's press conference to say, Governor Ivey says that the Alabama mask ordinance is needed, because now you're attributing the opinion back to her. So even in something that seems like a fact, it still needs to be attributed back to the original speaker. We also want to write speech and meeting stories for the audience. Why does this particular thing matter to them? And focus on that throughout your story. You need to fact check all the information that was provided in a speech or meeting. If you watched presidential debates, for instance, you may note that both speakers included things in their speeches that weren't actually factual, and there were lots of AP fact checks based on what they said. So you, as a journalist, need to ensure that the information that was given is accurate, and call a speaker out if they provided information that was not accurate. You need to use quotes from speeches or meetings for opinions, expert opinions, and emotions. Again, this goes back to attributing everything back to a speaker. And of course, we want to use descriptive language of the event or situation to give the audience a better understanding of what happened. Here's an example from WBRC News, Fox 6 News, of a city council meeting that happened at the end of September. This had to be a fun city council meeting. I've sat in many of them, but this was a budget meeting that lasted 5 hours because there was so much debate among the city council members and the mayor. So you can see here that they have picked out what is most newsworthy. What matters to the audience? Well, the 2021 budget was approved. What was interesting about it? Well, we're appealing to the news value of controversy with the debate between all the council members. We're also appealing to the unusualness of a single meeting taking 5 hours. Ugh, I'm cringing just thinking about this. Obviously, this is going to matter a lot to the public, but it's also interesting in its unusual aspects. all things that we need to consider. So this is a pretty well-written story from Fox 6 News. So now that you understand how to write stories based on speeches and meetings, I highly encourage you to look up what meetings may be occurring in the week that your print story is due. Again, these are really easy ways to write stories. You may not want to attend a city council meeting, but it is going to be one of the easiest stories you can do. And now you can do it all virtually thanks to COVID. So be thinking about particular speeches or meetings that you could write your story on so you can pitch it on Monday. So for your discussion post, you're going to be doing a meeting writing exercise. Then make sure you do AP Review Homework 4. This is going to be written in the exact same style of the exam to help you prepare for next week's AP exam. But it's only half the questions. It's 25 questions to allow you to read chapter 17, which is on public affairs reporting. This is going to be the second most common type of reporting for journalists, so something you need to read and pay attention to.